quite weathered, it's quite soft. When it was probably laid out, it was probably better cemented than that, because this is the very surface layer. So as we go down, we're going into more sedimentary rocks. Now, interestingly, in this profile, although that's weathered sandstone and is geological material, it is actually important to us, because even today, look at that, everybody. People who can see that weathered sandstone that I am scraping away here is clearly soft and also wet. So it dries out quite fast, but that's where it's about this depth. The water table is currently sitting in this soil, or at least some accessible water is sitting in this soil. I'll cover it up, otherwise it'll be gone for the next group. We're seeing what looks like quite a dry pit, but you have to bear in mind that at the point it was dug and there was no access of the sun to this hole yesterday, to about here we've got quite damp sandy material. On top of that, and you should get your eye in, you can see there's something else laid on the top of that. So on top of there we've got this material, which you'll hear is still quite hard. This is still geological material. It's got a range of things going on, and those of you with good eyes will see there are bits of yellow stuff, bits of redder stuff, there is a bit of random squared off grey stuff, and handily just here, for example, there's a large lump of granite. So those of you can see. So what that helps to tell me is that this material isn't local. It's in inverted commas, because it's what the geologists call it, a drift material. A material that's wandered about the surface of the earth, hence its name. And drift materials are either blown, well, no one's blowing that boulder of granite about. They're either moved by water. Well, equally we have to have quite fast flowing water to move that boulder of granite about, and usually when sediments are moved by water, they're all much of the same size when they're deposited. Because when something is deposited out of water, it's to do with everything the same as in estuaries. We get clay banks and sand banks, and we get a segregation of the particles. So what we've got here is actually a much more mixed up material, hence my quality geological deduction says we've got stuff left behind by a glacier. Well, that makes lots of sense, because if you go back 8 or 10,000 years and looked up, you'd have gone out, but you'd have got about 800 metres or thereabouts of ice above your head here. So we have large, strong glacial coverage in the Cheshire Plain. Those glaciers began and stretched out from, sorry, we're now into the Shropshire Plain, stretched out from Welsh Wales, and they came down from the mountains there. And so we have a mixing of materials that have been collected up on the route of that glacier. At the point it was moving, it has a very thin layer of supersaturated material, and usually local, just underneath itself, that's helping to frictionally, or alleviate friction, to lubricate its movement. So the glacier at the bottom melts, and that grinds and moves things about. And then of course, quite a lot of ice melting and retreating, leaving behind whatever was in the ice. So we get all sorts of bits of stuff left onto the surface, and potentially quite compact as the glacier is moving back over the top of it. This is not a huge depth of that material, and I think there was probably some post-glacial sorting of this material, because what's definitely true in this layer, although it's got some big rocks and some little rocks, what it doesn't have is a lot of clay. So a traditional glacial left behind material really has a bit of everything in it. This has no clay anymore, so that suggests to me that water has run through it. Doesn't have to run very fast to take the clay away. So clay tends to get put into suspension relatively easily and moved away through the soil. So we've got this glacial dump material that's been fractionally sorted. It's had the clay taken away from it. It may of course be that actually we didn't have much clay in the glacier to start with, equally, that the material that's been picked up in this local area wasn't particularly clay rich. But actually that's less likely than I would hypothesise anyway, than my post-glacial sorting. So end of geology lesson, but useful to just think about this soil in its context. So we then start to really think about soils, not about geology and geomorphology, so that actually what happens on that land surface. Now in the UK we're relatively young, so these things have only been happening on this soil for around 8 or so thousand years, so it's not old. Other land surfaces, other places that many of you have worked or potentially dug holes into Africa, into South America, and certainly into Australia, you can have millions of years of these processes going on. And what happens is that weathering, literally the work of weather on the rock, starts to change the minerals that are formed, And the same thing that, or the thing that mainly happens is that biology turns up. So in this glacial conditions, it's really cold, not a lot's going on. It only has to ameliorate slightly and we get into the tundra or taiga conditions that we associate with the Arctic Circle. But loads of mosses and loads of stuff going on and beginning to grow, and biology begins to interact with minerals, and we start to get the incorporation and the mixing of organic and mineral materials together, and we start to get what you can see on the top of this soil, a darker layer. So as that organic material begins to form and be mixed in. Through time we move from those mossy systems through grasslands, through a whole range of things, and we can see that in pollen stories in local areas. I don't know what the exact pollen story is for here, I know Northumberland a lot better, but nonetheless the same story is true, that we go from the mossy through the grassy into trees. And so 4,000 years ago, successional vegetation across the whole of the UK. You can tell the story about squirrels skipping merrily from Land's End to John O'Groats. In the Atlantic period, we got really good tree cover, and the roots would have then been reaching down through the profile. And we think, and I was spotting this before, is that what we've got evidence of here is cracks into the subsoil where you've got different sorts of things going on there and there, people get their eyes in, which are possibly where old tree roots in that 4,000 years ago were occupying space in this subsoil. Now, none of that really matters, because actually what we are managing is this level above. So our question is, well, okay, what's going on in this level above? So by eye, what we can see relatively easily, you probably need to get your eye in because it's a bit. So on the side we get the bottom, or sorry, the top of this hard layer into, well, this slightly softer stuff. Well, that is a neat, nice, tidy line, and it goes from being orange to being brown. So that looks like an old cultivation depth to me. Unsurprisingly, it's about 10 inches down. It's a fairly traditional depth to find the maximum extent of cultivation that's happened. That maximum depth of cultivation may not have been happening on this site until the 1940s, 1950s. It probably wasn't happening in the 1700s, but certainly at that point we've got a mixing and an incorporation of the minerals across the surface. The more recent layer, and again just by feel, well, and a little bit by colour, well, there it is. We've got this top layer, so the newest cultivation depth probably here. So we can tell the story, and I've not yet had the farmer to check whether I'm right or not. We can tell the story of the soil by looking at it back, if we know something about the geological history of the place we're in, all the way into its formation from what we're seeing at the surface. But your real questions, and Joel is listening to me, are about how we manage and describe, how we manage and describe that soil going forward. You could have stayed, you wouldn't tell me to carry on talking. No, sure. Manage and describe that as we go forward, and so that's kind of where Joel's going to pick up in terms of what we might do in terms of management.
So if we're having a look into a pit and thinking, okay, well, how are we going to assess this? What are the metrics? What are the indicators I might be looking for to maybe assess the health and the functionality of the soil? And I guess that really starts for me looking at the soil surface. A fundamental principle of soil health is the soil covered. Do we have living plants, ideally, green leaves and living roots, or do we have at least some stubble, some residue, some mulch layer covering that soil? Nature always wants to cover that soil, so that's the first indicator. What's the surface looking like? And then straight away we're looking at this organic horizon, where those roots are, where the plants are growing, roots are growing, dying, being turned over through decay, releasing those root exudates we discussed. And so of course in this organic horizon we're looking at colour. We expect and hope to see that a bit more darker and tan in colour. And then, but really one of the next really important and very useful kind of indicators is even simply how does the soil smell. This is a crude way to assess the biological activity, but nonetheless it can be useful. So of course we're going to find more soil smell in that organic horizon where those roots and root turnover is happening. So grabbing some soil and having a smell. Now smelling the soil on its own, you might not be able to really tell anything. It's about calibrating yourself, and it's about comparisons, relative. So let's smell the soil, let's go and sample another bit of the soil over in the hedgerow, or in a good part of the field, bad part of the field, one farm to the next farm, etc. Once you start doing this more often, you're calibrating your nose to what you're looking for, what is a good smell, what is a bad smell. So ultimately we're looking for that earthy forest floor type kind of smell. And okay, unfortunately, of course, moisture is a rather important and functional thing that helps to drive the process, microbial and growing processes. So the fact that the soil has dried right out, I have lost a lot of the soil smell. Of course, there's not a great deal of happening there, so it's impacting on its smell. So I'm having a smell. If I'm honest, I'm not really smelling anything here, but we're looking for that nice forest floor smell, and that is crude, but a good first point. Can I see nice organic cycling? Can I smell it? And relative, if you do that more and more in different sites, you'll calibrate yourself. And then we're looking at these initial little clumps, these little beds here, and these aggregates that are beginning to form. And you can see these in that small surface horizon here. And we're looking at kind of the strength of these aggregates. We're looking, can we see roots in them? How well are they being held together? How strong are they being held together? Can we see lots of micro little pores? So I had a piece, I don't know, I passed it around to the last group, and I'm not sure where it ended up now. I had a nice little piece that had some really nice micro pores and some really fine root spaces. But we're looking at these aggregates, and again, relative calibrate yourself to kind of giving them looking at how tightly they're, how well they're structured, how they're holding together. When you kind of feel the resistance, when you press them, are they crumbling apart like powder, or are they breaking apart? Are they still being held together but just breaking apart into larger chunks, highlighting more glue, stickiness there, microbial glues, or are they just pulverizing to powder, suggesting again that there may be not as much microbial activity there? Are they very hard to press? Are they really tight and compact, or do they more easily crumble apart? So we're assessing the kind of the shear, the strength of that aggregate there, but also how well those glues are holding together. That's totally linked with the smell component there as well. So that's kind of what we're looking for next, is the formations of those aggregates and the strength of them. And as we look at those aggregates and we start then glancing down the soil profile, we are broadly speaking looking for where the natural fractures and fissures are, and looking for the lines in the profile. Can we see lots of more vertical lines, cracks and depth and dark spaces moving downwards? Or do we see lots of horizontal lines, of course indicating potentially some more compaction there when we start to see, particularly it's getting harder, the soil's quite dry and sandy and just flogging up the view here, but you know, do we see certain fractures where there's lots of horizontal lines, or are we seeing more vertical lines? Sorry, I won't do that, let me just clear that for a second. So you can see down here, there are the beginnings of some really nice vertical lines that we can see. There's some nice cracks that are moving vertically, and this is therefore creating that initial release in that soil for those cracks and crevices, for those roots to find and go down. So are we seeing more horizontal lines is a really important indicator, and if we're seeing anything too horizontal, that's a sign of that compaction there. So as we glance down and are looking at those lines, looking at down the profile, we're then asking ourselves, well, can we see some signs of life? Can we see some earthworm channels? Can we see some roots, plant roots going down there? And so as we glance down here, you can see that I've got some roots at this depth. We're looking at all the various roots here. I'm moving down here, there's some roots. I'm moving down here, there's a really nice big root right there. There's some roots here, there's some more roots here. I'm going down here now, I'm down here, there's another one down here. I'm still going down here, I've got another one down here. We're getting deeper and deeper. I mean, we're all the way down here. We're pretty much down at that sandy layer there. Pretty much there appears to be roots that have got that far down and are potentially tapping into moisture from that sandy subsoil sandstone layer. So they are going down there, and we can see those. Now we also see a certain trend and habit of those roots to be very concentrated where the earthworm channels were. There's a really nice bunch here that's really coming out of a channel here. There's another really nice one here. You can see, you guys probably struggle, but there's a really nice earthworm channel, starts there and goes onwards down here, and you can see this nice cluster of roots here. So there's all the signs that they're all finding those channels and growing down, particularly around those earthworm channels. And so of course we talked about the importance of therefore these structural processes in order to structure the soil so that important things can move in and out of that soil. First one being gases. We need oxygen to come down into the soil to feed those organisms. They're aerobic organisms. They breathe in that oxygen and breathe out that CO2 just like us. So we have to have good structure so oxygen can come down to fire up that biology. But as they feed on carbon and grow and respire and exude there and release their CO2 through respiration, Well, that CO2 needs to come back out of the soil so that it can be captured by the plants growing on that surface, and those stomata on the other side breathing in that carbon dioxide. So without structure, we haven't got that basic fundamental gaseous exchange between microbe and plant. But of course then we're talking moisture, in rainfall and infiltration. Do we have good, again, soil cover? That's why cover is important, to improve that infiltration rate. Is that moisture able to infiltrate and get down into that profile? How well does that profile then retain and hold on to that moisture? And how well is that soil percolating that moisture out of the bottom, out of those subsoils, recharging the groundwaters? So this is the critical thing about the physics and structure, water exchange. And does those earthworm channels, of course, are great spaces for the water to get in and get down. So there we've got gases, we've got water, and then what about the last thing there that earthworms will deposit as they leave their channel? That worm cast, a little packet of fertilizer, nutrients, carbon, highly available. So we then, of course, no wonder we find plant roots. What do? They will go and concentrate themselves where they've got good gas exchange, good moisture being held, and a little packet of fertilizer to supply those minerals, which catalyze that process of photosynthesis to produce more carbon to cycle back in.
We are being chased by another group, I've noticed.
A couple of quick questions.
But if you have quick questions as you're moving off, if you want to just come and ask, that's fine.
What effect does subsoiling have on that structure? If you're talking about horizontal fractures. If you run a subsoiler in there at 18 inches or something and it disrupts your vertical fractures, is that a good thing or a bad thing from your point of view?
I was going to say, you should only run a subsoiler if you've got a problem you're fixing. If you haven't
So
got a
after
problem,
2 years of cattle on grass lays,
what's the evidence in this
yeah,
profile?
that's what I'm wondering.
So if you don't
Round
see any
feeders and
problem,
that sort of where they congregate around a gate.
so you may have a targeted approach, but always look and identify where your problem is. Don't fix something that doesn't exist, otherwise you're burning the needle for no good reason and potentially causing yourself problems. Yeah, you probably won't do any harm running a subsoiler in this sandy soil, but you won't have done any good. You'll have worn out
I
your
get the
metal.
plough in the ground at this time of year, that's the only thing.
You'll have worn out your metal. Yeah, so unless you've got a real reason for doing it, apart from just thinking it might be a good idea and we've got dry conditions, yeah, we've got no evidence in this particular hole, and you're right, around a ring feeder we probably would. But actually under cattle feed it's not a subsoiler, is it? The compaction is going to be in the top 10, so that's an aerator, not a subsoiler. So using the right tool for the right job can be tricky, because actually that potentially means you've got to have lots of tools or lots of availability of pieces of kit. So really understanding where that compaction is likely to occur then helps you buy the right piece of kit for your piece of ground as well. So borrowing a few to try, demonstration always a good sneaky way to say that you want to just try something in those targeted areas and have a better look.
If there was a problem with the subsoil, what would you see here?
Joel was just describing those flat and platey. Have the HDB stand got the Healthy Grassland Soils card on? No. So there is, if you have a look, if you keep that phrase in your head, Healthy Grassland Soils, there's a two-side card which has some really nice pictures of structure in good to really poor condition to help calibrate your eye. But now is not the time to look. But as the soil wets up, you can also go to somewhere you know there'll be compaction, ring feeders, gateways, and actually just look and see what your particular soil does under compaction, and that'll get your eye, as Joel was saying, in for what the main bit of the field then might look like, so you calibrate for yourself rather than doing it just off it.
Ladies and gents, if we could just